Okay, so lots has happened in the world of sport today. Obviously, I think a story that I've been following is the unfolding issues with Neil Lennon at Celtic. Their draw against St Johnstone today, they've slipped further behind Rangers. That's another game in hand that they failed to win over the teams run, which was Aberdeen and Hibs. And I did a video on Neil Lennon's position yesterday afternoon, and I think that the Celtic board have to be considering their options with Neil Lennon going forward. Sergio Perez has won his first ever F1 Grand Prix after, well, I haven't watched the race, but that's a positive that we have a new race winner in F1. I think F1 is a formula of motorsport that has become a bit too predictable, with the same cars and the same couple of drivers winning every race. To have a maiden race winner, I think, is important. I know Lewis Hamilton wasn't there because of COVID, and we can discuss coronavirus affecting a lot of sports. The England cricket tour to South Africa, there's been some unconfirmed reports of positive tests in the England camp. There's been reports of unnamed South African players testing positive, and it's normally this time of year, every couple of years, that England tour South Africa in the cricket. And something I normally look forward to watching over the Christmas period is the England cricket tours of South Africa. I like watching that over the Christmas week. But Alistair Cook, as an ex-player, is saying he cannot see feasibly how the tour can continue. It will be interesting to see if the England cricket squad do return home early from South Africa and from Cape Town. That's something that is pending, and we'll wait and see what happens. Tottenham have gone top of the Premier League with their win over Arsenal. Who would have thought that when they sacked Pochettino and hired Mourinho as manager? We'll have to see if they can continue this run of form deeper into the season. This is a side that hasn't won a trophy for over a decade, and the last trophy they won was the League Cup. So it'll be interesting to see how Tottenham can maintain this winning momentum. Leicester have won this weekend as well. So Tottenham aren't the only team in form at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if Spurs can maintain that form going forward. Obviously, in Scottish football, apart from Neil Lennon at Celtic, we know St Mirren are being investigated for financial irregularities. The last time we saw clubs investigated for financial irregularities, I think it was Boston United. And obviously, Portsmouth ended up in a court case years after the event that the money went missing. So what happens with St Mirren will be interesting to see how the Scottish FA and the Scottish Premier League deal with St Mirren. Now, that is an interesting subplot. That really is. During an active season, a club being investigated after an audit. We could also discuss how Scottish sport has lost anywhere between 100 and 150 million pounds has been wiped off the value of Scottish sport since March. So this comes at a really bad time for St Mirren, at a time when finances in Scottish sport are in a mess. In some minor sport news, British ice hockey is an interesting one because obviously the Elite League has still indefinitely suspended their season. We have no idea if the season's going to take place in the EIHL because of the four countries that make up the United Kingdom having teams, and only the English teams have received government aid. The other teams in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are issues over funding and support packages in place. And the National League, there are plans to get the season started in January. So, and if fans can't be in attendance, a streaming service has been set up, and there are discussions taking place over the next week or so between the English Ice Hockey Association holding meetings. So we could see some other elite sport returning with fans in attendance very, very soon. On the Rugby Union, England obviously getting that last gasp win against France. Questions remain over Eddie Jones' position as England coach. And Eddie Jones has been a divisive character since he was appointed England coach a few years back before the World Cup, about his tactics, his selections, the style of play that England play, some of the histrionics in the media that he has. So that will be interesting to see what the RFU decide to do. Obviously, long term with Eddie Jones, and whether they extend his contract past next year. Obviously, the Autumn Nations Cup was obviously a different last minute deal in my mind, considering that teams had to pull out, and that obviously the Fiji's participation was heavily disrupted with the coronavirus as well. This is why I keep thinking to myself, will elite sport in Europe go into another full shutdown? We know some of the high-profile professional hockey leagues, that's ice hockey, have decided to suspend operations and have like an early winter break, pre-Christmas break in Finland and Sweden. They've decided to stop playing for the next couple of weeks, which is interesting. We know that the NHL and the NHLPA are still in discussions about a start date, which is looking likely to be later in January. They obviously were targeting January the 1st. There's discussions over the escrow payment and retaining salary. So we'll have to see that. On the elite ice hockey league, the EIHL, because there are teams that play in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They haven't had that central government funding that the English teams have had. So half the league has a funding crisis. There's also issues with some of the arenas that are used by the league as well. So it's British Ice Hockey, the English Ice Hockey Association, and the Scottish, Welsh, and Irish associations decided that they need to restructure their governance. That's possibly a positive that's come out of this, and the lower levels, and I think even the Elite League, when they do decide to return to play, they have said the streaming services. I think all teams are going to be offering a streaming service where you can watch at home rather than go to the arenas to watch. That's an option I will be considering if and when play resumes in January. There is a concern that yes, the top two levels of British ice hockey won't return until September. That would be a massive concern, considering that the World Championships take place in May. So that'll be interesting how that affects the national side as well. And that lack of play, how match ready these players are going to be. And only some of the British players play overseas. And even the overseas leagues are starting to shut down for brief periods. And that's an ongoing development. That's not just, we're having that is interesting that the Swedish league, a country that didn't go into lockdown at all, has suspended play for a period of time. The Finnish league as well, and a lot of the NHL prospects and NHL players have been loaned to teams in Finland and Sweden to keep fit, to keep playing, especially those who were drafted in the draft. NHL and AHL teams have lent their players or allowed their players to temporarily play in Europe, and now these leagues are being shut down. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens with the NHL and the discussions that they have going on in place. Something else that's very interesting, I'm an NRL fan, more than the Super League when it comes to rugby league. The plan is to start the season on time in March. So in 3 months' time that we have the NRL kicking off games, I'll have some pre-season games. It will be interesting to see if the World Club Challenge takes place in February. That'd be very, very interesting to see if that actually takes place on time, considering what's going on, and with the vaccine being days away from being released in this country, in the UK at least. It will be interesting to see what happens with the World Club Challenge if it does take place this year, if it does get played, if State of Origin will remain at the end of the season, or they bring it back to a traditional slot mid-season, and in the build-up, obviously, to the Rugby League World Cup. Right. Obviously, I'm not a fan of Amazon particularly. I occasionally order things off Amazon, but I very rarely order online. If I want something, I try and find it actually in a brick and mortar store, if at all possible. I'm not a massive fan of Amazon. I mean, with my job, the amount of waste Amazon packaging produces, it's insane. 60% of the boxes that get put in the back of my bin line in the cardboard section is Amazon. They overpack things. There's a lot of wastage there. It baffles my mind. And there is the only reason why Amazon have got any sports rights at all in this country is they declared a profit for 1 year. That's how they got sports rights. They finally declared a profit. For the first 25 years of Amazon's existence, they didn't declare a profit. The only way they could get any sports rights on their streaming service on Amazon Prime was to declare a profit for tax purposes. The British media regulators refused to allow them access to sports rights. That includes the Premier League, that includes rugby, until they were a profitable company. So there's been a lot of tax dodging there. The fact that PS5 and obviously the new Xbox and all that, and I haven't got the latest Xbox or PlayStation. I can't afford it. There's been a lot going on away from the channel with family reasons and bits and pieces. But it hasn't necessarily met with universal approval. The fact that Amazon are trying to buy up all these rights, a lot of people going, they have some shady tax dealings, they're not paying their full share of tax. And we'll see what happens going on with the media rights for a variety of professional sports. Amazon are here to stay. Let's make that clear. Amazon are here to stay. They are a cheaper alternative to Sky and BT. Depends on what kind of sport and how you want to follow your teams. For me, I like the NRL website. I'm going to get the AFL website next year as well, so I can watch every AFL and NRL game, and it's for a fraction of the cost. You work it out, you break it down. What's the Sky subscription? The NRL app is through the NRL itself. The AFL likewise. So you get ad-free content if you're rewatching the game. If you're watching the game live, which occasionally I do on the weekend, yeah, you get the Australian ads, and they're kind of funny. But for what you're paying, you get a lot more for your money than your Sky subscription or your BT subscription. You do get a hell of a lot more for your money. What I've noticed is when the NRL resumed play, which was brilliant, they had fans back in attendance pretty quickly. The Australian government has dealt with the coronavirus pandemic and had great discussions with the professional sports leagues in Australia to allow sport to return. So yes, I can see fans being back in full capacity at some point. If Australia can do it without a vaccine in Australia a couple of months ago, getting fans back in reasonable numbers back in the stadiums, especially for sports like the AFL and NRL, which are reliant on their memberships. So your season ticket holders, your club members, and also the average fan who may be a casual fan who may not go to every game, heavily rely on. They agreed a new TV deal. They protected the majority of salaries. They were able to get games going. What we've seen in the Northern Hemisphere is a lack of, for a better word, cooperation between the various sports. I think the various sports need to work together, not against each other. They're all trying to vie for bits of the pie. They're all asking for government aid, but they're not willing to communicate with each other, it seems. There's a lack of transparency in the process. And the way it's been dealt with has been pretty shocking. But I can see fans being back at full capacity at some point within the next 12 to 24 months. I can see it. The problem is getting through the next 12 to 24 months. Yes, this rescue package has been agreed between the Premier League and the EFL, and League One and League Two still get the 50 million. And regardless of the financial position of League One or League Two clubs, they're going to get a minimum payout of either $250,000 for League Two or better part of £400,000 for League One clubs. They get a minimum payout. I do think the World Club Challenge could take place. It's an interesting one. How you would do it, bearing in mind the Super League season has generally already started by the time the World Club Challenge is played, and the NRL is technically in pre-season. So that's going to be interesting in quarantining a team. So the team that travels will have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Has to quarantine for 2 weeks. There's no debate about that. Because until the vaccine is fully rolled out and until the infection rate has dropped well below 0.5 of an R rate or something, the visiting team has to quarantine for the 2 weeks. Now, I forget who's meant to be travelling away this year in the World Cup Challenge. If it's the Super League side having to go abroad, that would affect fixturing here because they would have to leave for 2 weeks, be in Australia, prepare for a game for a week, play the game. That's 5 weeks. 5 weeks they will be out of the country. In the Australian side of things, yes, it's in pre-season. They could schedule it for earlier in the pre-season, so it doesn't affect warm-up preparations for the regular season. But that means the Australians will have a shorter off-season. So that's going to be a bit of a logistical head-scratcher, but it'll be a good test case for the Rugby League World Cup. I really do believe that the World Cup Challenge, if it is to go ahead, will be a good test example of how to get a team in, quarantine them, prepare them for a game, and then play the game. Of course, the Rugby League World Cup is 21 teams. It's a tournament, but it's still a valid argument of, okay, you've got to quarantine these guys. coaching staff. There may be limited fans in attendance, but we'll see what happens. On putting sport online, I don't mind it so much. I think it's a more accessible format. When it comes to sport online, I would wish that it could be a little bit cheaper. Not that I'm complaining about my NRL subscription or my future AFL subscription, because I think in real terms, yes, I could watch that on Sky Sports and BT Sport. I think it's Sky Sports that has the rights for the NRL and the AFL, but I wouldn't be able to watch every game. Plus, I'm paying more per month if I get it on Sky. £12.50 a month or 130 quid a year versus I think it's 50, 60 quid a month for a Sky package, something like that. So for the equivalent of a 2-month Sky package, I get a year's worth of every program related to the NRL. And I get to watch games going back for the last 3 years. If I've missed any games or I want to catch up on a game that I've missed or look back at a game a couple of years ago, I can watch it, any documentaries, any debate programs, all the related media. So it's not just I'm just getting the matches, I'm getting everything. So it's a good little app to have. It's a good website to subscribe to. And it's a very useful tool because I can rewatch a match at any time and the ads are taken out. So you don't get that disruption when there's an ad break to watch the game. Am I critical of some of the things the NRL has done? Yes. I think they obviously had a change of leadership at the top with Todd Greenberg leaving his position and being replaced before the restart. I think that was crucial in getting games back on. I think the clubs had lost trust in Todd Greenberg, and Peter V'landys, his boss, had no faith in him either. And under Todd Greenberg's time in charge of the NRL, there's been a lot of scandal. There still is a lot of scandal. The rugby league is a sport that has the capacity to self-harm itself on a regular basis, in the words of Paul Kent, obviously a well-known journalist in Australia. He does say that the sport's capacity for self-harm is just, it keeps doing it. You could say the same about football. Obviously, here in England, the capacity for self-harm is evident. Look at the Millwall situation. Now, there's a reason why the Kick It Out campaign is a FA-affiliated charitable organisation. I'm in favour. I have a Kick It Out t-shirt somewhere. Do have one somewhere. Don't know where it's gone. I have some programs where the Kick It Out, have bits and pieces in the match day program. The Kick It Out campaign and the Kick It Out charity has been there for a very, very long time. It shows the failures of the Kick It Out campaign that we're having the BLM debate and the kneeling before games. This isn't about the fact that I feel the protest movement has been hijacked, yes. But if you criticise Black Lives Matter, apparently you're racist. No, I'm a realist. The situation at Millwall is going to be replicated across a lot of grounds. As more and more fans are allowed back into stadiums, you're going to see more and more of a reaction. And from a lot of reasonably minded fans as well. That's what is generally the problem. And then the reaction by certain members of the media hasn't helped, because they're saying if you disagree with Black Lives Matter, you're a racist. No, you're just not a Marxist. The Millwall situation, Millwall is a club with a reputation of unruly fan base that has been in the news for decades when it comes to crowd trouble. The fact it was Millwall, which was the ground where the booing happened, is a big, big embarrassment for football. I think you look at the Millwall fan base, there is a history of some nasty incidents, not just racism, but nasty incidents going back 40 years. Bearing in mind, I think, was it Millwall West Ham, I think about a decade ago, a friend of mine was at that game with his nephew and his mate. There was a guy stabbed in front of his son at the old Upton Park Stadium by Millwall hooligans. Millwall is one of those clubs that has a negative reputation, regardless of the situation, because of elements of the supporter group. I use that supporter group loosely, but the reaction of fans, I'm not, look, this is Millwall. You have to look at the history of the club and the issues with the club supporter base. There are problems there. This is a club that has negative headlines written all over it and has done for decades. You can't deny that Millwall has a reputation that isn't good. Millwall is also a club that doesn't have a very large ethnic minority fan base. I think the problem stems. Yes, there is problems in society. We're not denying that. We're not denying there are issues within society. What is happening is the press have jumped on the bandwagon because it's Millwall. They've made more out of the story than they should. But if you look online on social media, there are even people from ethnic minority backgrounds who have had enough of the BLM movement and say it's becoming more divisive and more harmful than it should be. But you look at the fact that Millwall was the first game played in front of fans when the kneel took place, the reaction. The media always likes denigrating football fans as yobs, and every other sport is near on perfect, which is not the case. I've seen disorder at rugby league games. I've seen fans be idiots at rugby union games, which is a rarity. And ice hockey matches, I've seen fans be ushered out of the building. Football seems to, the problem, I think, with Millwall is they have a reputation, a negative reputation, and have done for a long time. But it'll be interesting to see how other fan bases react in the coming days and weeks as more and more fans are slowly allowed back into stadiums. It'll be interesting when, let's say, it's a very heated, charged derby atmosphere. Let's say it's hypothetically, let's say we've got a game. Let's say the FA Cup. There's one for you. The FA Cup. Let's say, I don't know. I think of two teams that wouldn't normally meet in the league, haven't met in the league for a while, or even in a league game. Bournemouth, Southampton. There's one for you. Bournemouth obviously been relegated to the Championship, although they're in a very healthy position in the Championship. Let's not kid ourselves. Playing Southampton, let's say, for argument's sake. That's going to be a charged atmosphere anyway, as fans are allowed to be, allowed back in. It's going to be a charged atmosphere. If that was a full stadium, it would get very interesting. What is interesting is that they weren't doing this when fans were allowed into the stadiums before March. As there's been no fans in the stadiums, and what I've seen online is I'm a reasonable person. I can always have a reasonable debate. But there's a reason why the Kick It Out campaign has had lots of negative press as well. And I haven't seen the Anton Ferdinand documentary, and I have no reason to, because it's a football documentary, and I find them really painful to watch. They're not great documentaries. But what's come out of the Anton Ferdinand documentary is all these years after the event between him and John Terry, it is mentioned that there was a lack of faith and a lack of trust with the Kick It Out campaign, and there have been references made to some dodgy financial dealings at Kick It Out. Lord Ousley's been under the microscope for some of his financial dealings and some of the things he's got up to. But the whole thing, from what I gather, the Kick It Out campaign there's been question marks over some of the financial goings on at the organisation and how robust it is in discussing things with the FA, the Premier League, and the EFL and the non-league about issues involving racism and accessibility for all people, all that kind of thing. But the fact that it's been going on as in an organisation for over 25 years, it's clearly failed in its mantra. And yes, we have come a long way, but I think it's clearly failed in its mission statement is the best way to describe it. I think Millwall was targeted by the media. The media have jumped on it, and the media in this country, especially the sports media, can be a very vile beast. What I've noticed, they're like a pack of wolves. The British media are gutter trash to me. I don't really read newspapers or try to follow the mainstream media. If there's an independent sports website, although there is no mention of West Ham because Millwall have been their target. They're the nasty club. They're the club with the reputation. That's made the headlines. Bang. Let's whack that out there. Let's make that a major story. It's as if, the mainstream media wanted Millwall to screw up, right? Millwall have always had a negative reputation in the media, and yeah, they've also quite rightly got a negative reputation for the way they've dealt with hooliganism, homophobia, sexism, racism. The club has got a bad reputation from other fan bases and their own fan base, I just point out. But at the same time, the media, being the jackals that they are, the gutter rats they are, it's Millwall misbehaving or Millwall doing something that's controversial. Let's jump on that. There's a couple of clubs that they salivate for when the fans or the players or the club itself screws up. Millwall was one of them. West Ham, well, there's no mention. They've already got their story. It's Millwall. They're the enemy of the people right now. Let's go and write articles about Millwall. I think what is interesting, and I think this is the problem with football in this country, is yes, it's the major sport. There's a football club in every town, every village, every city. There's football clubs up and down in every county in the land. There's county FA. It's part of the culture and the fabric of this country on the sporting side of things. And the same can be said for Scotland, and the same can be said of Wales as well to an extent. But it is part of the fabric of a lot of communities. I think the mainstream media's obsession with it, where they will praise players one week and then slag them off the next. The amount of ex-players who come out saying that their relationship with the media was not great, and how they were saying, well, I'll wake up in the morning on, let's say, a rest day from training, maybe injured, so I might be doing community work and club work, and they'll pick up a newspaper and they're in there. So I didn't do that. What's the Sun, the Mirror, the Times? What are they writing about? No, I didn't say that. I didn't have them. And the amount of lies printed about. Yeah, a lot of players don't help themselves. So your Jack Grealishes, your Mason Greenwoods, Kyle Walkers, yeah, misbehaving during the lockdown, all that. But at the same time, the press, the media. I mean, a lot of overseas sportsmen have commentated on the way the media reacts in this country. It's just not great. You go somewhere else. You look at the way sports teams are reported on in Canada or Australia or New Zealand, US to a certain extent. It's a lot different. It is. It's a lot different. The majority of journalists, are far more factual in what they report. They're far more decent in what they report and how they report things. They have a better relationship with the players and the athletes that they are reporting on or interviewing. And then you come over here and it's a toxic atmosphere. The British press, the French press isn't much better. The European press is, I think, in my view, quite a toxic bunch of people, but the British press is vile. But you listen to interviews with ex-players that they've given to independent journalists, for example, and documentary makers. They go, my relationship with this newspaper, this website wasn't great. These journalists, were writing stories that weren't true, were not correct, had no bearing on what was actually going on. And you listen to it, and it is generally one of the reasons why no one stood up for Millwall. No one. No, because the narrative right now is if you disagree with the protest movement, you have to be a racist. On the Irish side of things, I mean, yeah, the Irish don't have a good reputation when it comes to race relations and sectarianism. But when you call them out on it, I mean, I'm of Irish descent, so I done my family history and all that. But I try and, on this channel, keep the politics out of it. Politics and sport is a dangerous, dangerous mix. It really is. We've seen it through from 1936 with the Berlin and the Winter Olympics in 36 in Germany, all the way through till now. The IOC is infested FIFA is infested with political interference, bribery, and corruption. We've seen political boycotts where nations or teams have pulled out politically. So Yugoslavia were thrown out of Euro '92, replaced by Denmark, who went on to win the competition. But we have seen for 80 years sport be hijacked by politics in various forms, mostly at the Olympics and World Championships in various sports, and more recently when it comes to football and rugby, both league and union, where national governments will support the bidding committee, the country or the city that wants to host the event. So yeah, we'll give you political support because we can pump in government funds into refurbing an area, such as the London Olympics, with East London being completely refurbed. And that's one of the few Olympics that actually has delivered its Olympic legacy. Athens bankrupted the country. I think when we're discussing sport and politics, I try and keep it out of the channel as much as possible. Unless, this is the problem. It shouldn't really get involved. They shouldn't mix, but unfortunately they do. And sometimes they have no choice when it comes to like parliamentary select committees. If there is an issue within a sport, and that sport does receive government funding, such as the Olympic sports, through government grants, then yes, that's where that mix should happen in the right environment. But I do think, unfortunately, too much politics and sport is mixed. It's having more divisive consequences than is necessary. I think sport is one of the few things that could unite and build up the morale of the country right now, rather than disunite it, divide it. It's done nothing to help with the mood of the nation. I think there's an atmosphere of great tension and division. And I've noticed this over especially the last 2.5 years, more so. I think for me, I haven't watched a lot of football since the resumption. I've watched a couple of games. I haven't really been very interested, to be honest. I think my love of that particular sport is slowly seeping away, quite honestly. I think, and because the way the politics and the sport has unfortunately mingled in the wrong way, for no one's benefit, in my view, I think it's creating more problems and more division. It's doing nothing to improve relations between communities, tearing people apart. And we'll have to see what happens as more and more fans are allowed back into stadiums. More and more fans are allowed to interact with each other, because I don't think the Millwall and West Ham is going to be the end of it. I think there's going to be a growing reaction. Unfortunately, what is interesting is, yes, something was mentioned earlier, was that the London-centric media, and to a certain extent Manchester-centric media as well, that's the two major media centres of the country, are so up their own arse. They are. The rest of the country does have a voice. It just feels ignored. And we'll have to see what happens. I think the FA has already got itself in a problem. Greg Clark's resigned. His interim replacement was part of the board anyway. Another board member has gone. The only female on the board, she's left. The FA has got a power vacuum right now. The Football League and the Premier League waited until literally target zero to get a financial rescue package put in place after Rick Parry said, well, at least 10 clubs can't afford to pay their staff this month. Whether that deal was already in the pipeline before the end of November, we don't know. So they left that deal until the last minute. That should have been discussed in the summer. It really should have. The fact that clubs were furloughing, using the government furlough scheme to basically lay off staff, right? And the government pick up the bill, but they couldn't, and the players and the clubs couldn't come to wage deferrals, which I think would have been the best option. The players have still got their money, the taxman would have still got their money, and the players were like, no, but we're supporting the NHS. When it actually then turns out there are players currently under investigation for tax avoidance and tax evasion, didn't go down well. These same clubs that furloughed non-playing staff, claiming they couldn't afford to pay them, then spent £1 billion in the transfer window, which went down like a sack of shit. Not gonna lie, yes, I've dropped my first expletive in there, but football has a way of shooting itself, and for other sports are like, we're gonna go bust. We're gonna go bust. Other professional sports in this country are like, well, we've run out of money. Without fans, because the football has the greedy TV deal, there's not enough money to go around to support the other sports. Some sports make do with very weak TV deals. Say very weak. Rugby League's TV deal for the Super League, Championship and League One is worth one club's yearly money from the Premier League for their TV deal. It's a pittance in comparison. And then you go, Christ, Rugby League had to get an emergency loan from the government. The ECB, for some perverse reason, is still pushing the 100 format, which no fan bloody wants. If you want to get cricket onto free-to-air TV, you have 3 very good international formats that you could put on international TV. You have a T20 competition you could put on free-to-air TV. They're making up a brand new competition with brand new rules. And you're going to yourself, you see over in Australia, the Big Bash, that's on free-to-air TV and it works really well. Oh, wait, it's an existing format and they've marketed it very well and they've got existing players to play in it. So the fact the ECB have already said we're making massive losses, we're losing money. Oh, by the way, this new format we're going to bring in, it's going to lose money for 2 years. We're going to delay it for a year. We're going to lose more money. But we're going to forge ahead with a loss-making enterprise at a time when no one can afford to lose money and people are losing their jobs, considering the ECB have just laid off 20% of their staff. They're still forging ahead with a loss-making enterprise. It makes you wonder who is in charge of the ECB and who is in charge of their PR department, their accounts department, who's looking at this going, this is a good idea, because it's clearly not. And I cannot believe when you've already got existing formats that work really well. The problem is the reason why people are tuning out is because it's behind a paywall. And there's your problem. You could expose the county game to free-to-air TV. A game a week over the 4 days the game takes place, you could have every team in the county championship structure could get be on TV once a week. Every team over the season could have, be it the away team or the home team, be on free-to-air TV, and players that we haven't heard of get exposed on national TV because people will watch. I can happily sit through a 5-day test match. The problem is the ECB thinks young people aren't interested in cricket. No, we are. You're not exposing us to it. It's your problem. So they come up with a brand new format that actually is really confusing. If you read the rules, it's a mess. It's like someone's got some spaghetti letters and dropped them on the floor and then tried to spell out the English and Welsh cricket board with them and made a mess because they've got the rule book and they've dropped page chapter 5 of the laws of cricket. They've spilt their soup and they've stained the page, or pages torn out, and they've tried to rewrite the page that's damaged, and they've just made up a load of crap. It makes no logical sense. The 100, it doesn't. It's not cricket. It's not. It's a different sport to try to invent. And no one. Look what happened with the AAF Football League. It failed after like 6 games. 6 weeks it failed because it had different rules to the CFL and NFL, and the players that they picked up were even outcasts from the CFL that couldn't cut it in the CFL. It was a weaker form of the game, and crowd numbers at stadiums plummeted after week 2. It failed after, I think, week 8. Didn't complete its first season. I've been watching a series of videos by another YouTuber called The Hockey Guy about the WHA. Now, if you don't know what the WHA is, it was a rival league to the NHL in the 70s. It lasted, I think, 8 years. Failed. The rules were exactly the same. There were no difference in the rules, but it failed because the finances weren't secure. I think only 4 teams still exist from the WHA. All but one have been moved. The Oilers are the only team never to be moved, relocated and renamed. Harvard Whalers, Carolina Hurricanes. The original Winnipeg Jets became the Arizona Coyotes. Briefly was Phoenix, now Arizona. Quebec Nordiques, now the Colorado Avalanche. Three out of the 4 teams that survived the WHA, went to the NHL, have been moved. The WHA didn't last very long. Failed. It failed miserably. Only a handful of the teams were competitive, and those teams were the ones that ended up in the. I think I'm not the only person to go off football. A lot of people are losing interest. I mean, cricket. I always have time for cricket. However, the ECB needs to change its direction on media rights. There are reasons why we're calling for free-to-air cricket, not calling for the 100. They come up with the 100 on it. Oh, but it's going to be on free-to-air, but we don't want it. They're saying sales figures are really, really good. Still going to lose money. And when an organisation that's already announced that it's lost over 100 million to 350 million this year and has had to lay off a quarter of its staff or a fifth of its staff, and they're forging ahead with an economic plan that makes no logical sense. If you were a business CEO and you say, oh, right, okay, the company's losing money. We're losing money. We need a new product. Someone in the products department goes, we can't get this product, but unfortunately for the next couple of years, it's going to lose us money. And you're the boss going, we don't have a couple of years to keep losing money. If we continue hemorrhaging cash at this rate, we'll liquidate. The ECB can't liquidate itself, but it has a cash flow problem, a massive cash flow problem. And if the 100 really fails, because we don't know how many fans are going to be allowed in attendance in the summer. That's the thing. That's what people aren't realising is fans are allowed back in dribs and drabs. But will that be capacity? Because the ECB numbers are based on the fact that they're going to sell out every stadium. And they're still going to make a loss. And the only ones in favour are those on centralised contracts who are yes men, because it says in their contract you cannot criticise the ECB or speak your own mind, and those in the ECB themselves who are, well, sucking up to the broadcasters. No one I can think of has got anything positive to say about the 100. The rules make no sense. Why would you have a 100-ball format when you could have a 10-over format? A half version of T20 and a push if you want short, sharp, get 2 matches a day in. You could get 2 matches a day with a 10-over format. You've already got the T20 format, which is not being pushed by the ECB. It's been really hampered by the ECB through its entire existence. And the team names, they're crap. And the main sponsor is a fast food company that deals in fast food, fatty, salty snacks. KP Crisps, KP Snacks. That's hardly healthy. It's not like it's like an organic food company or a green energy company or something that's positive for the environment. It's a fast food company. We're trying to fight an obesity crisis. And I'm not going to lie, the uniforms, the kits, they just look like fast food packaging from the 90s. They look hideous. Absolutely hideous. Garish neon colours. They look absolutely vile. I don't know. I don't know at all. I haven't seen, obviously, the rules for under-18 overseas players in football, but I know there was a discussion ongoing about it because we have seen, obviously, Man City and then Chelsea fall afoul of transfer rules and UEFA and FIFA rules on underage players or youth players. There was a debate about restructuring the rules, but I'll have to try and have a little look into that. On the side of the ECB, it's nice Sky. Well, the BBC are involved, but it does seem like some TV executive has come up with an idea to in a boardroom meeting, probably high as a kite on cocaine, probably, because that's how TV executives in the 80s came up with ideas. And if you look at some of the sports ideas where there's been TV rights issues, like the Super League war in Australia is very similar to what the ECB is trying to do with the 100 format, and very, very similar with this, European Super League. One is interesting, okay, is the big money making, the big money league, which the rival league to the existing, actually fails every time. The WHA failed in North America. The Super League failed in Australia. The rival cricket tour in the 70s failed. the World Cricket League failed. All these American soccer leagues in the 80s, 70s, and 80s all failed because they were throwing money around like it was going out of fashion. It wasn't sustainable. I don't know. Do I know what's happening with Catalan Dragons and Toulouse have with Brexit? Well, we do know that the final Super League team is yet to be finalised. Toulouse is one of those clubs that has put forward their name to be considered to be accepted as the 12th team. I'm leaning towards the London Broncos getting it, personally. They've got better financial backing. They're a more established club. They've played in the Super League before. For most of their Super League history, they've only spent a couple of seasons outside the Super League since it was formed. I will go for the Broncos as the safe bet. Toulouse is, I think, the favourites in some people's eyes. I don't know what's going to happen. I think it'll be a very similar situation to what the New Zealand Warriors have with Australia and New Zealand. There will be some kind of agreement made. But we'll have to see what happens. I can't see Rugby League wanting to lose face either. Because Catalan is a Super League club and they've already lost Toronto. I think, and because they play in the Rugby League heartland of France as well, they will be losing a lot of face if there were to be any issues with them continuing to play in the English league structure, because the French Rugby League structure is not of the same standard below those two clubs. While there's some good semi-professional Rugby League played in France, there is no doubt on that. It's not of the same caliber. They're not developing players they were in the 70s and 80s. The state of the game in France needs rapid investment, and it's not getting it, which is a shame because the French have actually come up with some brilliant players throughout their history. And I can look at the French players of yesteryear who've represented the national side, played in England, played in Australia. There have been some French players who in their time, been very, very great. And the thing is, the Nazi occupation of France and the Vichy government basically shut down rugby league. If you played rugby league, you were considered an enemy of the state and you were arrested. It was illegal to play rugby league for 4 years in France. And in southwestern France, which is very regional, very proud of its regional heritage and all that, around Toulouse and Perpignan and basically between Bordeaux and Toulouse, that was a hotbed of the resistance. A lot of people saw that as the final attack on their town, their village, their community, and they saw that as a cultural insult from the Parisians, the people from Paris, who had surrendered to the Nazis and then collaborated with them, and they would play games in secret. It was banned under the Nazi Vichy regime. When it comes to the Rugby League World Cup coming up, and in 11 months' time, 10 months' time, it is going to be interesting to see how the preparations are going to take place with what's happened this last year. I can't see the RFL and the organisers rearranging it. I can see it going ahead. But I think it needs to be a success. And I think this is a chance for rugby league to try and grow itself on a national imprint outside of the north of England more. This is something which I think has hampered the growth of the game. Is it's a lack of exposure to the Midlands and the South. And I think going forward, I think financially it's going to need to do that. It's going to need to reach a bigger sports market than what it has for the previous forever. London Broncos notwithstanding, London Skolars to a point. I know there's teams in Coventry and in the Midlands, but they do need to take that next step and grow the game outside the traditional areas, because it does risk losing ground to other sports. It does. Rugby league does risk its growth. Quite frankly, there was an opportunity in 2013, and that I think was my favourite World Cup. I think I was more involved the 2013 World Cup and 2017 because every game was live on TV. The 2017 World Cup only the England games, which I thought was a mistake because you had the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scottish also playing, so you had the home nations. I think on the side of rugby union, I haven't watched any of the Autumn Nations games, not at all. Had no interest in a tournament that's just been shoved in the international calendar just to make up the money. And the fact that they just shoved the this international tournament in, and then Fiji couldn't play in most of their games because of COVID, and Japan withdrew because of COVID concerns and the biosecurity protocols. Rugby union is shooting itself in the foot. Super Rugby is disintegrating this year. The issues over the South African participation in Super Rugby going forward, and the fact they pulled out of the Rugby Championship, and it's just become the Tri Nations with Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand for this year, shows a disunity in some of the Tier 1 nations. And for all those saying Georgia should go in the Six Nations, have you seen them play in this autumn international series? They were crap. I know. There's a guy who's been posting all the autumn international games up on YouTube. I haven't dared watch any of them personally. It's like having a second Six Nations to split to two groups with Fiji and Georgia in there. To me, it's a badly thought through idea, and all these people go, oh yeah, it's great having international rugby. People are still dying, and the fact that players were testing positive in Fiji just got decimated by COVID. Says to me that I can see international sport shutting down at some point this winter. Again, I can see, unless there's biosecurity bubbles in place and these athletes stick to them, which as has been proven for the most part. I know the NRL and AFL for the most part avoided biosecurity breaches, and those that did breach biosecurity were punished and fined by their respective clubs and leagues. But you look at the NFL. The Denver Broncos put out a guy who hadn't played American football since college as their quarterback. They ran out of quarterbacks. The Tennessee Titans decimated. I mean, teams are going down with COVID tests all over the place. And this is the wealthiest sports league in the world, apparently, the NFL, one of the biggest money makers, And the NFL are still saying we're going to have a full attendance at the Super Bowl. What? Are you joking? The NFL is still believing it can have full attendance at the Super Bowl. The NHL can't even get a resumption of play put in place on a start date given, but the NFL is going, we're going to have full every fan at the Super Bowl. What? That just shows the disunity. I mean, this is a sport that has had whole teams test positive for coronavirus. This has had a team in the Denver Broncos run out of quarterbacks because either injured or got COVID, and had to call up a guy who hasn't played for a couple of years, who was undrafted, who was on a practice squad, who hasn't played a competitive American football game in a couple of years, and it took 38 minutes to get a completed pass. Now, I'm not an overmassive fan of American football. I will watch the occasional game. But the fact that a professional sports team ran out of players in order to fulfill positions, and they had to sign a guy on a one-off contract just to fulfill a fixture list because they ran out of key players, tells you the situation with professional sport. And I do believe a second sporting lockdown is coming, unless they severely sort out the biosecurity protocols. Sport is one of the few things we've got going for us right now, and they can't even get that way. The whole thing is a shambles. I think on the side of the England game, from all the press reports, it was a shocking performance. And Eddie Jones, there's a lot of question marks over his entire time in charge of England, whether he's the right guy for the rest of his contracts, whether long term. I mean, I could look at Eddie Jones's performance as England coach and look at the results and just go on results alone. That doesn't take into consideration going into all the stats of possession, penalty. The penalty count is always too high with England has been for a decade. The penalty count for England has been too high for a decade plus. I mean, Christ. Since England won the World Cup 17 years ago, you look at England's penalty count per season, per game. it is higher than average. If you were to get the Six Nations as an average, right? If you were to get all the Six Nations from England through to Italy and put their numbers through a computer for penalties per game, England come out quite high up on average, above average. If you were to look at all the tier 1 and tier 2 nations, so every autumn series, every summer series, you know, and you put them all through the computer, you look at the penalty count and the amount of yellow cards, England come out quite highly. And I've been doing my match reviews of Six Nations games and autumn international games and World Cup games and summer tour games in the past. I've got the whiteboard out and I break down who scored what, penalties, how many penalty count, note, the important, the one-off note of the game. On his side, here's a little random stat. I regularly comment on England's penalty count. Regularly. And this the thing is, this wasn't even a full strength French side. If that was a full strength French side, England would lose. That, to me, tells you something. If that was a full French side, a fully available French side with their best players that they could select, with the style of play the French have been playing over the last 18 months or so, England lose. But you can only play what's in front of you. And the fact they've got the win, so they've got the win. That's what the final stats will show is England won. That's what the stats will show. England won. Plain and simple. England won. And on another day, yeah, France are either motivated because these are guys who are fringe players who are trying to put their hat in the ring for future selection for France. They played above themselves and played beneath themselves. But again, this is a French team in transition, bleeding in new players, bringing in the old style, as I call it, the flair style, with the power game up front, and changing their philosophy. On the England side of things, and I look at this, especially over the last 3 years, that the channel has existed, 3.5 years. I've watched a lot of sport. Not so much lately, but I've watched a lot of sport. I look at the penalty count, and I look at the England penalty count compared to other teams, and how it and how do I put it? Other teams have improved their penalty count and improved their discipline and improved their fitness and improved certain areas of their game. And England's penalty count is one thing that stands out as ill discipline constantly. It doesn't matter if it's Eddie Jones, Stuart Lancaster, anyone before, going back to the end of Sir Clive Woodward's time onwards, the penalty count is far too high. It doesn't matter who you're playing. It doesn't matter if England are playing in the Six Nations against Ireland, Wales, Scotland, France, or Italy, so they're normal opponents for half the year, or they're playing in the summer tours, or they're playing against the Southern Hemisphere tour nations, or the tour nations in what would have been the autumn internationals. Their penalty count remains sometimes near on 20 penalties a game. On average, about 12 to 15. That's too high. That's far too high. And the other team is in single figures for most of the time. And that, for me, is a worrying sign long term if you want to have sustained success. Discipline. You can win with a penalty count in the short term. You cannot win long term consistently with a penalty count that way. You can't. It's long term. It's a negative trait to have in a team. It holds the team back, but they are still winning games, and that's what gets me. Is they are still performing, but it isn't attractive, and this is where Robbie Ewing has a problem. It does have a problem. And the thing is, Eddie Jones only contracted until 2021. We don't know if he's going to be in charge for the next World Cup, and we don't know if he's going to extend, and we don't know who's lined up to replace him. That's what's interesting to me. Is he signed an extension past the World Cup? It's a year since the World Cup. He's got 1 year left on his contract. So this time next year, we could be having a debate whether he's staying for another couple of years, finish off the World Cup cycle, and leave at the end of the next World Cup, or if he's going and someone else is coming in halfway through the World Cup cycle to prepare the team for the next tournament. What will be interesting to see is how England perform in the Six Nations and how those Saracens players perform, because they'll be playing a lower level of competitive rugby in the Championship. And the higher level is the Premiership. So it will be interesting to see how those Saracens players are performing next year and whether they are still selected for the England side. Because to me, you've got to be playing that higher level of you've got to be playing that higher level. And you could say the Irish players, the Welsh players, the Scottish players, the Italian players, the French players are all playing elite level. Yeah, you've got these Saracen players who are still in key positions within the England squad playing a level below. And they may win every game in the Championship. They may steamroll it. But they're playing lesser opposition. So that intensity level is going to be lacking. So when they are called up to the England side, they're missing out on that intensity level that the regular season will provide. And then they are going to come unstuck. I think today's possibly proved that. But we'll have to see what happens long term and the Saracen situation and all that. But the Saracen situation has highlighted problems within another sport that isn't football, and it's money problems. There's a reason why rugby union and rugby league have salary caps. They cannot afford not to. Football long term cannot afford not to. We are on a precipice where professional sport needs to control its expenditure. Some sports do it very, very effectively. Football doesn't. And what we've seen, and this is where you can link this into rugby as well, is rugby has a salary cap system for a reason. The finances do not make sense without it. The TV deal is not good enough without it. The average attendances aren't good enough without it. There's less professional teams for a reason in both league and union. The sport is not sustainable without a salary cap system in place. And even with a salary cap system, even with the salary cap system, rugby union has massive financial problems across the board. Professionalism hasn't necessarily worked. On the side of leaving out Exeter's players, I think that is bizarre. They've proven themselves to be very, very. What they do at Exeter is how they develop that team and how they've grown that team and how that team has progressed since it joined the Premiership, since it got promotion. It has. They were written off their first season. People were saying on the eve of the season they're going to get relegated. They'll be a one-season wonder. They've now cemented themselves with a good philosophy, good selection policy, good youth policy, prudent spending, but getting the best out of players, and players getting and players taking a home team discount to stay with the team. And some very shrewd overseas signings, and there's a reason why they're the best team in the country. There's a reason why Saracens won all those titles. They were well, fiddling the cap, weren't they? Some of those players should never have been on Saracens' books because it was not affordable. They shouldn't have been on those salaries. And this is where the salary cap system has now worked because Saracens have been punished. Exeter, though, I think it's bizarre that not more of their players are getting selected. It's a head scratcher for me. You have players who play for Northampton and Leicester and all that. Teams that have been less successful in recent years continue to get selected because the clubs they play for. It's a matter of time before someone has to look at that selection policy and go, are you seriously telling me that an Exeter player who's playing on a team that wins a lot, is winning trophies, shouldn't be selected? Now, you can argue combinations and team chemistry is one thing at international level. And some players do perform better at international level than they do at club level and vice versa. but because these extra players are getting a lack of exposure at international level, you just don't know how good they're going to be. That could be one of the reasons why Exeter are doing quite well in domestic rugby, is because their players aren't being exhausted by being taken out of that Exeter system and thrown into the international sides. But I do think more Exeter players do deserve consideration for international selection. Vunipola, well, that's a problem when you've only got one real standout number 8, and you're not looking at other number 8s who are English who are available. And it's not just Exeter players; it's other players. There is no, I don't know what the RFU's obsession is with Saracens players, but I think they need to end that obsession very, very quickly. There are some very, very talented players playing at other clubs in English Rugby Union, and they've also got to look at, English players playing overseas. And I've said this: the selection policy of English-based players only is harmful long term. You have got talented players playing in France. There's a reason why Christian Wade decided to go to the NFL. He felt he was being overlooked by England, not given a chance. He's the top try scorer in Premiership history. He's now trying his hand to get into the Buffalo Bills lineup for next season through the international player pathway, and he very well could. He's got the pace and footwork to be a very successful running back in the NFL or wide receiver. He may not be the biggest, but my God, he's quick. And speed can make up for a lot of size deficiency in the NFL. And yeah, Christian Wade lost to English rugby because the RFU and the selectors didn't give him a look in. He got one cap. I can see their commitment, but there's players who've gone overseas, partly because they can get paid more in France. Who Benjamin and is a fullback who could play for England. He's gone overseas. But they can get paid more, and their careers are. And you have to think of it this way: rugby union careers can be notoriously short, a lot shorter than football careers. I will tell you that. And yeah, he might have gone over there to get a better paycheck, but at the end of the day, his career could be a couple of years at the top level. This is where I think football has. I think some of those players playing in France, and guess what? We have a number 8 playing in France. They should get a look. It doesn't matter that Exeter won over a French team in Europe. There are English players plying their trade in France. And the same debates we've had in Welsh circles about their selection policy being harmful to Wales. Look what's happened to Wales under Wayne Pivac. Their obsession with selecting Welsh-based players, unless you have a certain number of caps, is hindering the Welsh provinces in the ability to pay their players. They can't afford to keep them all. And if you are a Welsh player and you go, well, the club can't afford to pay me at, let's say, Scarlets or the Blues. I'm going to go and play for Toulouse or Clermont-Auvergne or Racing 92 because they can pay me. I can get a guaranteed income. I can get paid. There's no financial uncertainty. The French game has money, something that the English and Welsh games are starting to lack at certain levels. There's an economic reason why some players are going over there, and they're flourishing. They are flourishing. There is no debate on that. They're playing good quality rugby, a high level, of a similar intensity to the English Premiership or the Pro 14, but they're not eligible for selection. This is where I think Scotland and Italy have got their selection policies correct. As they are saying you don't have to play domestically to be selected. You can play overseas. We will select you. It's not a problem. Same with South Africa. They say you can play in Europe. It's not a problem. We will select you. South Africa relaxed their selection rules. It's benefited South Africa. They've won World Cups doing it that way. Australia and New Zealand, home selection only. And the quality level of Super Rugby is falling apart. Super Rugby is not sustainable. I don't know. I mean, you could argue that we are in a global. If rugby union wants to be a global game, you have to have a global selection policy where if you've got a registered player who is eligible to play for your country, he should play wherever he's given the opportunity, and he should still be eligible for selection for his home nation. I have no problem with that. I think the protectionist rules are very negative. because look at the domestic game. Cannot afford to keep all these high quality players in the domestic leagues they're playing. It's just not sustainable. This is why the Pro 14 clubs, especially in Wales, are having financial meltdown. This is why players have very short international careers and then they go to France because they can get paid. Or they even try their hand in Super Rugby, or even more perversely, Major League Rugby in the USA. There are top quality players who have represented France, South Africa, England, Wales, Ireland, who have gone over to Major League Rugby because they're guaranteed a payday. Their careers are short, but they're guaranteed to get paid, even though they're still top quality players. They've decided to take on a new challenge. They're willing to give up international careers because they just love the game and because of their country selection policies. So there are some top quality players playing in Major League Rugby, which I'm looking forward to resuming in March, by the way. I think it's not a bad level. There's not as much kicking in Major League Rugby as there was today in the England-France game. I'll tell you that. Go on the Major League Rugby YouTube page and rewatch a game from last couple of seasons. You will see a lot less kicking and more running of the ball. Yeah, there's more mistakes in there, and there's more interceptions and more knock-ons, and it's a scrappier game in the sense that the skill level isn't as high, but the entertainment value, what you're getting, is there. There's some big collisions, but there's a lot more running of the ball. There's less kicking and more running. More tries are scored. There are some high-scoring games. There's some very interesting games, but it's a breath of fresh air seeing more running of the ball, less kicking of the ball. It generally is. It generally is. And when the kicks are misplaced, there are a lot of players who are ex-track and field athletes, ex-American football players, and they've taken to rugby because they haven't really, well, for whatever reason, they didn't make it in the NFL because, well, the NFL is well, yeah, a difficult league to get into, ironically. Dropped from a practice squad. They've converted. They run the ball back. They run the ball back. And it's refreshing to watch. It is generally refreshing to watch running rugby. It is akin to rugby league in a sense, in the sense that there is less kicking. There's less aimless kicking, and there's more ball in hand. It may not be the same quality as European or Southern Hemisphere rugby in the sense that it's not at the same level. But I will tell you now, the intensity level, the commitment, the energy levels, and to a certain extent, the handling skills are reasonably good. And there is a clear intent to run the ball more. The only way for the American and Canadian games to progress is to make it professional. It is fun, but because it is so open and the quality level is a bit less, you do get some very exciting matches. There's no denying that. I think it's a good product. It's got a good foundation. I was a bit skeptical at first, but then I got into the second full season, and it was generally really good fun to watch. It generally was. I was really into last season, and then beginning of this season, that obviously couldn't complete it again. I was really enjoying watching the games. I think the format of the two conferences is quite good, but it was generally quite a good watch because the commitment was there from these players to improve. The intensity levels were there. The collisions were enormous. Bear in mind, some of these guys are converted NFL players and CFL players who decided to turn their back on American football and play rugby. I tell you now, the commitment and the physicality was there. There was no holding back from the collision. There was no holding back from getting stuck in. There were some big hits going in, and they were willing to throw the ball around, which was refreshing. And there wasn't a lot of aimless kicking, and that's something I felt was refreshing. The game management could be better, and they could be tactically a bit more astute, and they could be a little bit more rigid and structured. But seeing unstructured rugby is kind of fun when it's less structured and less, monotonous and well, going through the motions is kind of fun. Oh, how am I doing? It's my birthday today, by the way. I'm 31, getting old. Watson, I wonder what the point of Watson's and Mays feel like. What's the point of me being here? The 2007 World Cup final was very much like that. I remember watching that. That was a very forward battle and dominated. And Brian Habana and I think Saki on the wing, they barely touched the ball. I think they touched the ball twice between them, which was a shame because they were two very talented wingers at the time. So yeah, the 2007 Rugby World Cup final was not as fun as the third place playoff between France and Argentina. That was a fun game. The final itself was a weaker performer. The Argentinians in that tournament were a breath of fresh air in 2007. That, I think, for me, was the least entertaining of the World Cup finals that I've seen since 1995. I was too young to remember 91, but I do remember the 91 final wasn't a great final either from rewatching it, as in on the internet, rewatching the 91 final. So that's a very poor final. But that was still in the amateur era. And in the professional era, I've watched every World Cup final, and I think, for me, the worst one was 2007. It wasn't a great final. I think on when wingers are there, I think at times they do feel, what is the point of me, being here? But this is where that winger's got to come infield at times and demand the ball. The rugby league style, this is where Chris Ashton is I think, quite a good winner, is you will see Chris Ashton in midfield, trucking the ball up like a number 7 or a number 6 or a number 8 off a loose forward, running a rugby league line, as I call it, running on the shoulder of the ball carrier. That's how he scored a lot of his tries, was those infield runs. It's a very rugby league thing to do. You will see in rugby league wingers run the ball back. You don't have the mark. You don't have get the ball in the 22, kick it. Rugby league is designed for running rugby, and I think we need to have that infusion in rugby union at times. I think you need to have just players run the ball back at pace, because defences are expecting you to catch the ball, pass it, and kick it, or call the mark and kick it. That's what's expected when the ball goes into the 22 and someone catches it on the floor, or even if it bounces and they sweep it up and pass out, is kick it. If that is a tier 2 nation play, they probably don't kick it as much. The rugby union we watch internationally is generally the Six Nations and the autumn tests and the summer series, where the Northern Hemisphere teams tour Argentina, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia for the most part. You might see tours in Japan, you might see a couple of Pacific nations, but basically most of the tier 1 and tier 2 nations, most of them, ball goes into the 22, and the first response is to boot it. The second response is to give it a few passes and then kick, get a better angle. The third response is to run it back. In my mind, the first response should be to get a big, maybe the outside centre, maybe one of the 2 wingers, or the fullback, just to go, right, they kicked it. You've got to, have a look at that approaching kick chase. If you see a couple of front row forwards in there, although front row forwards now are built like, centres these days, but this is where the French rugby in the 90s, 80s and 90s, kick it. The fullback or the winger's got the ball, and they're going to run it back. And they're going to see there's a couple of front row forwards there who are blowing a little bit, who just run 60 metres, and you're going to find gaps. You don't have that as much these days, but I would like to see a back 3 or outside backs run the ball back. This is why I prefer rugby league, because you know that the wingers, the centres, and the fullback are going to run the ball back and try and break tackles, break the line, pop a pass, but get an offload in there before hitting the ground, and keep the play the second phase. You don't get enough in rugby union, especially at the top level. It's becoming a bit of an arm wrestle. It's becoming over tactical and over coached. I think you need to allow players to go, right, I've got a bit of pace, I've got a bit of footwork, I can do that guy on the outside. And not enough players back their ability. So many players have played within themselves and don't back the ability that they've clearly got. But yeah, I think Watson and May must be thinking to themselves in games that have happened recently is, I'm not getting the ball enough. that must be intensely frustrating if you touch the ball. I mean, I watched an interview with Sam Burgess where he discussed, obviously, he played opposite centre, outside centre for England 2015. And obviously, in rugby league, he's a forward. And he can play anywhere between 40 to 80 minutes a game. And he's touching the ball 15, 16, 17, 18, 20 carries where he's going into contact. He's making 30 plus tackles a game. Rugby union, you might touch the ball twice and you might make 3 tackles. And that's where you're scratching your head. When you've got a big ball carrier like that in your centres, who can be very destructive ball in hand, give him the ball. This is why I don't get this kick philosophy as first option, or pass and then kick. I think your first option should be attacking as best as possible. And if that is the case, you want to run it. You want to run it. You want to single out that weak link in the defence, which could be a smaller player against a bigger player, or a player out of position who's not quite in the defensive line, and go for it. I think Eddie Jones is a divisive character. I think what he did with Japan, they were willing to run the ball all the time. They were willing to be different. They were willing to mix it up into scrums and lineouts and attacking plays and free kicks. And that's what has given the basis for Japan to be successful, is they've carried on that unpredictability. He gets the job at England, and this is what is interesting. He was the assistant coach for South Africa in 2007. He was the coach for Australia in 2003. He's been to 3 World Cup finals as an assistant or as a head coach. He's won one of them as the assistant. As the head coach, he has not won one. But what is interesting is he has made some bold selections in the past. But I will say this, I think his best period of form was with the Australian side in the build-up to that 2003 World Cup, and then at the 2003 World Cup. His best period as a coach was not with Japan, it was with Australia. Japan, I think, is his second best period as a coach. I think the problem that professional rugby union has got is the arm wrestle. It has become, there is no change in body type anymore. The front row forwards aren't what they were built like 15, 20 years ago. Your fullback is the same size as an outside centre. Your wingers are the size of second rows. It's become a sport for just oversized individuals. Rugby league, I think, again has that problem, but at the same time, I think rugby league has got the rules right, where the NRL's brought in the 6 again rule. It's tinkered its rules to make the game better. Whereas rugby union, the scrums have become a mess. The breakdown has become a mess. The new laws on tackling. These players have been coached to tackle badly for years. That's partly on coaching as well. And some players' tackle technique is absolutely horrifically appalling. How Lee Halfpenny hasn't retired because of concussion, how George North hasn't retired because of concussion, yes, they're 2 Welsh players. That is beyond me completely. How they can still tackle like that is bizarre to me. The tackle technique of some players is just non-existent. A head in the wrong place. It doesn't matter if you hit him here or down by the waist. If your head's on the wrong side, Lee Halfpenny's got no tackle technique at all. He tackles with his head. And this is a coaching thing. They're coached how to scrum illegally, which leads to injuries. If you scrum straight, you don't get neck injuries. This is why so many front row forwards retire with shoulder and neck problems. I think Keith Wood and Andrew Sheridan, 2 prime examples of players who were front row forwards whose necks and shoulders were destroyed, and they had to retire well before their time. And Keith Wood was told if he had another neck injury, he would be paralysed. Keith Wood is one of the most colourful characters in the game. He retired 17 years ago under medical advice. He could have played for another 5. Andrew Sheridan could have played for another 3 or 4 years as a front row forward had they been scrummaging properly. The last 17 years has been a mess with scrums. The feeds from the scrum half is a joke. Both hookers don't go for the ball anymore. The illegal boring in really winds me up because that's basically you're injuring your opponent. There's another way to put it. Because you're not driving straight, you're going to risk injuring your opponent. I forget which was the Australian prop in the 2003 World Cup, but he basically is one of his discs in his spine. I think his neck popped. He had a prolapsed vertebra disc, basically paralysed him because of boring in. And this is when scrums were still reasonably competent. Against the All Blacks in the semi-final, he basically his neck ruptured. That's the way to describe it. The scrum rules, they need to teach these scrummaging properly because from the age of about 15, 16, you were taught how to scrum illegally, basically. And while you're getting and then when you're losing against the head with a penalty, you shouldn't do that. You've got to be able to hook the ball. And then when you're going backwards, the referee can say, right, use it or lose it. And then you get pushed off the ball. But because you're all correctly bound, no one should get badly injured, right? Because there's illegal binding, boring in, trying to illegally wheel the scrum. The hooker's not hooking properly. And people wonder why these forwards are getting some hideous neck and shoulder injuries because of that. And then it becomes a mess, and you have all these constant resets, and it's embarrassing to watch. Now, rugby league has got its own problems with the scrum, and they're looking at changing the rules regarding scrums, and they're trying to make the scrums more competitive. And that is a problem. On the Bath side of things, they are an established Premiership club. They know they'll fill out the rec ground every week when fans are allowed back because they've got a loyal fan base who will continue to support a team that is dull. I've never really enjoyed Bath's rugby. I'm not really. I mean, I've got a friend who plays for Bath. I went to school with, but I'm not a fan of their style of play. But I've never been a fan of Bath anyway. My dad was never a fan of Bath. I've never been a fan of Bath. But their style of rugby doesn't set the world on fire. Doesn't set the world on fire. But I think that's the problem with all Tier 1 rugby right now, is it's too mechanical, it's overcoached, too structured. There's not enough flair in the game. There's not enough guile in the game. It's become just a meat fest. Rugby league for me is more interesting because there are some really skillful players. I mean, just watch some of the NRL tries scored in the final series. Just watch any of the NRL games from last season, from round 3 onwards. There was some really good skill on display. There were some big guys going against big guys who worked out, well, if I'm going to have a collision with him, we're not going to go anywhere. But if I use a little bit of skill to aid me during the collision so I can offload the ball, break the tackle, then we can get somewhere. There was some really, really, really entertaining play in the NRL this season. Rugby union could learn something from rugby league in keeping the ball alive and keeping the ball moving and thinking outside the box and playing unstructured at times. But don't get me wrong, you need structure in rugby. Both kinds. You need structure. You need a structured platform, but you also need to have that flair, and you don't need to have set plays every 6 seconds. I don't think you should have teams fined for not having enough outside back scoring. I mean, that's not the way to do it. But I think there needs to be more encouragement to play. And unfortunately, in the modern game, it's all about money, isn't it? And results. You can be a very entertaining team throwing the ball around, and you could lose every game. But I think some of the rules that we have in place, especially with kicking, they need to look at the kicking game? Is it too excessive? Is there a minimum amount of tackles you have to have before kicking? I think there are ways, and it's a mindset. I think it's more of a mindset because the game has become such an arm wrestle and so tactical and all that. There is a bit of a mindset there that does need to be changed. And I think you need coaches to be willing to experiment, take risks, but you also have to have players who want to back their ability and give it a go. I think there are ways to try and bring more running into the game. You have to allow players to express themselves without fear of failure. I think there's a fear of failure there as well because we've got the bonus point system in place, so you could lose and play some really attractive rugby and lose, but get a bonus point or two. You could score your 4 tries, you could lose by less than 7 and get 2 points out of a loss and play really well and play some attractive stuff. Or you could win by being boring and just grind out a result. And unfortunately, professional sports is a results business. If you combine a power game with a flair game like the French used to, that's great, but you've got to be consistent in doing that. And that's where the French fell back, is they weren't consistent enough over a long period of time. However, on their day, they could beat the All Blacks, beat England, beat South Africa, beat Australia, and score 50, 60 points in a game. And then the following week, their discipline would go, and they could lose a tie game 10-5. I think it has to be a whole mindset. If more teams were playing what I call the French style of the mid-90s, the late 80s to mid-90s, where there was a lot of flair and you had the power game up front, but then you had these outside backs just running the ball and not afraid to run the ball and not afraid to bring in the loose forwards to run the ball, you might get somewhere. If more teams were willing to go, that's the style we like playing, and the fans were to warm to that, you might get a change in the culture of a sport. I think at the moment it is a results-driven business. The money situation doesn't help, but it's whether teams are willing to play a sevens style South Pacific Island. I mean, when I watched some of the Tier 2 nations play, such as the Americas Championship and the Pacific Nations Cup back in the day before the Americas Championship was formed, which involves the US, Canada, Uruguay, Brazil, and Chile and all that. There was a lot more of this, we'll back ourselves running a bit less structure. I think the Tier 1 nations are too structured. And I think, well, obviously the goal is to win games and grind out wins. I don't think there's enough flair in the game. I think that's been coached out to some extent. I think you've got to allow your players to back themselves and to play with that little bit of flair and a little bit of vision, because I think that is, players are discouraged from thinking on their feet and trying to create space. I think the sevens, there's been a lot of emphasis on sevens in the last decade or so because of the Olympics and rugby being an Olympic sport again. There's been more emphasis from unions on their sevens programs until this year, when some of the programs have been rolled back because of financial issues. I'm surprised that hasn't had more of an impact on the outside backs and the loose forwards being willing to run the ball more, like the French and some of the Tier 2 nations have been willing to do. So Japan and France, I think, play with a flair style where, you know, they do back themselves a little bit. And the Japanese are becoming more consistent as well, which is why I think their style of rugby is quite entertaining to watch, because they do run it a lot. If you look at the French side of things, they're getting their flair back, and it is entertaining. And they've got a lot of young players who have no fear, it seems, of failure. I think what needs to happen with all the Tier 1 nations is just to watch. They should go and scout and watch how some of these lower Tier 2 and Tier 3 nations play. They do play with a lack of fear, for a better way of speaking for it, because their game is less structured and because it's a different style of rugby union. I think they could incorporate some of those things. If Sam Underhill said if people don't should go watch league if they're not happy with how they're playing, that is a dangerous thing in a World Cup year for rugby league. Very dangerous thing. And there are games at the Emirates in London. That's a dangerous thing. That's a dangerous statement. The thing is, I'm actually swinging more towards league every day. I have been doing for 2-3 years now. I've been slowly. I mean, I've always been an NRL fan. I'm not gonna lie about that. I've always been a fan of the NRL, but I'm becoming more of a rugby league fan over a rugby union fan. And it is to do with the style of play. I mean, there are some games I've watched where I'm going, that is really, for elite level sport, not a great watch. It's very turgid. Um, I mean, the stop-start nature of some rugby union is a head scratcher. This is why I like Major League Rugby, because sometimes there's a good 4, 5, 6 minutes with the ball's in play, multiple phases where the ball will be turned over multiple times. Partly because it's a lower skill level. Yes, I've said that it's not a European or Australian or South African or a Kiwi level of the sport. In the sense, it's not the same as Super Rugby or the European leagues, but it's far more entertaining because the ball's in play and the willingness to run the ball a lot and fight for the ball on the ground. Both sides will turn the ball over. There's a battle for the ball in the ruck and the maul. There's a willingness to run the ball back. Partly because maybe they're not so the kicker isn't the kicking options aren't as accurate at the higher they would be at the higher level, so they're forced to run it. But even so, there's no fear in failure, and they're willing to back themselves, and that's fun. And Dupont and Entomac, yes, they are very exciting young players. Entomac can also play in the centres and at fullback. He's a very, very skilled player. I don't think he's necessarily just a fly half. I think you could have him on the field with another fly half, and he could play inside centre. I think he's like a younger version of Freddie Michelin, but more consistent, and I think a little bit more talented, and has a better reading of the game. Entomac is an upgrade on Freddie Michelak. I think their last decent fly half inside centre, he was also very skilled because he's more consistent. Dupont, I think, is one of the best young scrum halves in the game right now. He's showing no fear at all. There are some other very good players. The thing is, the French have had a lot of number 10s and inside centres in the last decade or so. They've not been. I think Tran Duc is one that's had the most run out at 10. They're starting to give Entomac a bit of responsibility. I mean, Scrella is a good 10, but he doesn't get a look in. He hasn't had a look in for a very long time. I think he's still playing. Tran Duc, I think, is the best 10 that France have for accurate kicking and being a solid, structured player. Entomac is a bit more unstructured. Now, if you were to have Entomac at 12 and Tran Duc at 10, or Tran Duc at 12 and Entomac at 10, that could be a very interesting combination. But Tran Duc is an experienced veteran these days. And obviously the French idea is to go with these young players. But I think you can still have Tran Duc as a good 10 option. But I wouldn't say any more than that. I think some of the other 10s and 12s that France have had in the last decade or so, they're either too conservative and just kick all the time, or they're not consistent enough. And then you have the issue of goal kicking. Entomac's a pretty good goal kicker. He's pretty consistent, and Dupont can kick a goal, and then there are other players. Tran Duc can kick a goal. I mean, they've got other players who can pop the ball over. But they have tried so many players at 10. And since, I think, the 2007 World Cup, I think they've had 150 or 160 players get a cap, at least one cap for France. They've gone through a lot. There's a lack of consistency in selection, and they keep changing the combinations. And it seems at various points they have one squad 1 week in the Six Nations, and then they completely rip it up and go with a different 15 with maybe 5 or 6 of the same players the following week. They need to be consistency in selection. And now that they've got Dupont and Entomac, and they seem to have that solid 9-10 axis. And bear in mind, Entomac can play fullback and inside centre as well. So he's a very, very useful player to have, because this time next year, another number 10 might come along, or they might go, Tran Duc, we need an experienced 10 for this game, just tactically. And you have Entomac at 12, or you say to Tran Duc, can you play at fullback or at 12? We'll have Entomac in there, but we need your experience. That's something that I think you need. The French situation stabilising. They've got a good young core of players coming through all at the same time, and most of them are outside backs, which is, I think, very entertaining. And they've mixed up the forward pack a little bit with a sprinkling of new players, and they're shaking that up a little bit as well. and we're seeing a new core of French players coming through at the same time. Bear in mind, these young French players have won the Youth World Cup together, so they're not inexperienced, but they are learning pretty quick at test level, at the elite level, and I think they could be dangerous at the next World Cup. The Amazon situation, there's been a lot of issues with internet, my neck of the woods. I don't have enough knowledge on Amazon streaming services. I don't have Amazon. I don't intend to get Amazon. I know my mum, brother, stepdad, they have an Amazon Prime Fire Stick, whatever it is. Simply for the Grand Tour. That's the only reason why they got it. But I'm going there for Christmas Day, and I'm going Boxing Day. I might watch some sport over the Christmas period. I might watch a Boxing Day football match. I might watch something that's on the TV. I know the NHL is not going to start till at least mid-January, as it's been reported now. I know the NRL and Super League ain't going to be starting well into late winter, early spring. So for me, there's not a lot of sport on, but I might give the Grand Tour a watch. I might use them. But I know Amazon have had a lot of complaints today. I've been looking on social media. There's been a lot of reaction to the quality. On the under 26 Six Nations, I'm not sure if it completed. I know the Women's Six Nations didn't complete, and that was announced very early on. The Women's Super League and Rugby League didn't complete either. So women's sport on both codes of rugby took a hit. People were going, "Oh, it's women's sport. Who cares?" They do. And to be fair, watching the England-France Test matches for the last couple of weeks, the women's game, they were very entertaining. I think the fact that I think a lot of people are wanting to stream these services, a lot of people are at home not working. I don't know. It's this time of year where those who are in work have decided to take some their annual leave around Christmas, book some time off. But well, I've only had a couple of problems with the NRL website crashing when I was watching. Now that could be to do with the internet. You've got to look at your internet providers as well and the amount of traffic. It is a weekend, and they're showing a weekend game. You've got to think the majority of people don't work on a Saturday and a Sunday, unless you're a police officer, a fireman, a council worker. Like me, I've worked yesterday, didn't work today, but I had the option to work today if I wanted to. Most people don't work on weekends. Most people's working week is Monday to Friday, possibly a Saturday. A lot of people are at home. That's going to be, affecting the traffic of the internet. A lot of people are using their internet connections. Could be an overload of the servers and all that because a lot of people are online at the same time. We'll wait and see. But yeah, I think long term the TV rights debate is going to be had. There's more calls for free to wear. The Premier League is showing its first ever free to wear game on Boxing Day. I might give that a watch on the BBC. Be interesting. I think long term ITV and BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5 might get more rights to not just Premier League but lower leagues as well. I think the Championship, League 1 and League 2 need to get more exposure on free to air TV if they're to financially get through the next 5 years. On the side of the under 26 nations, I don't know if it completed. I do know that the Women's Six Nations and the Women's Super League didn't resume. I'll be assuming as it's the under 20s, some of these kids are playing professionally at top level anyway. But I'll have to look into that, and on the next live stream we can discuss. I mean, I can look at it now actually, quickly before I end the live stream because I've got to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning. But let's have a quick look to see if the under 26 nations is completed. Under 26. Under 26 nations. Let's have a look. Start date 2020. They played 12 matches, so I'm assuming it didn't. Yeah, no, didn't complete. The tournament was suspended with 3 games left to play due to the pandemic and was cancelled in August with no winner announced. There you go. I think that was right. So England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales fixtures. The results were this: on the 31st of January, Ireland beat Scotland 38-26. Wales lost to Italy 7 points to 17. And France lost to England 29-24. So you were right, we did beat the French. Away from home. On week 2, Ireland beat Wales 36-22. Scotland lost narrowly to England 21-17. And France beat Italy 31-19. Week 3 went down to the wire between Scotland and Italy. Scotland won by a point in that game. 30-29 away from home. Wales beat France 14-11 and England lost to Ireland 39-21. And then Ireland-Italy was cancelled. England lost to Wales 23-22 and France beat Scotland 29-22. The next game to be played was Scotland beat Wales 52-17 and France-Ireland was cancelled. Italy-England was cancelled. I think when England-Italy was cancelled, that's when they said we cannot play the rest of the tournament because Italy are now 2 games cancelled and that would screw up the organisation. Six Nations Women's Championship matches were originally scheduled for February and March. And 7 matches in the tournament were postponed due to health and safety reasons. Partly because of Storm Ciara, which I remember did cause some problems. The Italy's matches against Scotland, Ireland, and England were all postponed because of the COVID pandemic in Italy. Scotland's game against France was postponed due to an undisclosed player testing positive for the virus. 7 other players and management self-isolating. The Women's Six Nations weren't completed either. In August, England, Italy, Scotland were meant to play a game, a rearranged game. That got postponed, and then on the 10th of November, it was announced that remaining fixtures would also be cancelled. So, no winner was announced either. They basically said no winner's been announced because we haven't been able to complete the tournament because of games outstanding. So, in that sense, I knew that the Women's Six Nations had not been completed. I didn't know about the under-20s, but yeah, a lot of games were cancelled. But it is what it is. It's interesting to note that obviously there are plans to have full Six Nation tournaments in February next year. And it was interesting to note that they did manage to complete this Six Nations, albeit obviously a couple of months ago. Maybe that's had a bearing on how England played today against France. Is they've crammed in a lot of international rugby in a very short space of time, considering that rugby union was suspended all the way from March through till September, October, and then they crammed all this international rugby with the 8 nations and the rest of the 6 nations in this very short period of time. That could have had an impact on how these games were played. But at the same time, I mean, I think rugby union now is overcoached and there's a lack of flair at the elite level. And that's my personal opinion on that. But we'll see what happens. I think that from what I've read of the performance today, it wasn't great. There has been talk of rescheduling the Six Nations at a slightly later date, but they obviously want to get that played and completed to avoid clashes with Euro 2021 and the Olympics. They can't reschedule it too late because rugby union is played at the Olympics, so you want to have your players available to play at the Olympics, and they can't really reschedule it too late because you're going to clash with other sports, and you want to maximise your TV audience, and you want to maximise your revenue. And if you're clashing with other sports, you'll be dividing revenue between a variety of sports, which serves no purpose. So it'd be interesting to see, obviously, what happens next year. But I'm going to call that a night. I've got to be up in not very long, about 7 hours. I've got to work. But I thought I'd just do a little impromptu live stream. But yeah, the RFU and the Six Nations as a whole need to be a bit careful with their scheduling, because obviously these players that just play in the Autumn Nations have got to go back to their clubs. They're going to have some enforced rest, go back into a bubble, and isolate, and then have to start playing again. And then obviously the Six Nations squads will be announced, and then these clubs have got to release these players again. So there is that club country debate. And squad rotation is going to be interesting, and whether we actually get through and have a completed season without any further lockdowns. Because if you're looking at it, Fiji, they got decimated by COVID. The European ice hockey leagues in Sweden, so the Liga in Finland, which is the highest ice hockey league there, and the SHL, the Swedish Hockey League, have suspended operations for now, for a couple of weeks, because they've decided to shut down. We're having outbreaks of COVID in obviously the Cricket Tour of England and South Africa. The NFL it's been heavily hampered, by the coronavirus, and we haven't got start dates for a whole variety of sports yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. We'll have to see what the 2021 holds. But there we go. Thank you very much for watching for now. I'll have obviously more videos for you in the week, and I'll see you all very, very, very soon.